Hello, I am Dan Assisi, and I'm here to talk with you today about war and conflict. And I find that to be a really hard topic to broach, because in one way, we all agree that war is fundamentally bad. So why spend the time to talk about it? Well, I posit that in fact we underestimate the role we play in peace in general, and that if we can take some minutes out of a day to reevaluate our impact into the world, we can perhaps find ways in which to contribute to a more harmonious planet and have a more harmonious life, so to say. And I hope to do that today in under 10 minutes or so by sharing with you one piece of good news, one piece of bad news, and asking one fundamental and important question. So let's start. I think the best place to start is to share the one piece of good news I mentioned. And that one piece of good news is that, in fact, it seems that war is in the decline. We say that because many different experts have come together to analyze the number of wars and deaths related to wars over the past centuries. And they have reached a conclusion, which you can see here, for instance, explained in this graph from Our World in Data, that there have been many different conflicts throughout our history for sure, but in the last century, we have seen a steady decrease in the number of people who have died in battle between governments and nations. If you look at the screen, you will see that on the left side in 1946, you see a big peak there, and then if you were to draw a line from the top of that peak to the top of the peak on the right side by 2016, you can see that the line is trending down. And that is, in fact, really good news for us. We can understand that the number of deaths in war and war in general is going down. However, does less war equals less conflict? I think that we have a point to make here, that just because we have had less armed conflicts and less people have died during formal war, we have not necessarily been a peaceful country, or I should say a peaceful globe, or Earth. And I think we can argue that in fact there are high levels of conflict everywhere we look. We are not getting along with each other, whether it's different countries or even different cities or even different neighbors. We are struggling with the quality of our human relations in general. So I think that we can also reach the conclusion that we are not necessarily better off just because we have less formal wars, because at the end of the day, what we are really after is peace and tranquility and happiness for everybody. And I think we can quote the Jewish historian Yuval Harari in his book Sapiens, where he says the real peace is not the absence of war. It is the implausibility of war. That is to say, just because we are not formally waging war against each other, different countries are not battling each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have achieved peace. There is still tension, there is still anxiety, there is still competition, there is still aggressiveness back and forth. And the real peace would really be finding that spot, finding that place or that occasion in which we would not even think about that. We would not even think about going to war or confronting other people. We are far away from that, but I think that we are sometimes lulled into a false sense of security because we think that war is something that other people do, and that's the challenge of our times. We sometimes consider that war is something that countries do, war is something that tribes do, nations and groups that are far away from us, and we don't really see our personal role in war, perhaps because we see ourselves just a tiny little cog in the machinery of world affairs. But if we look at the definition of war, for instance, it lends ourselves to really think that we are far removed from war, because most of the time we take war to mean a state of armed conflict between different nations or states. or different groups within a nation or state, according to the Oxford Languages. So I think that most of us, when we think about war, we think about countries going to war with each other. We think about World War I, World War II, armed conflicts, and so forth. And that's the general idea that stays in our heads. But if we continue to read those definitions down and reach the third bullet of the Oxford Languages piece, we'll see that a state of competition, of conflict, or hostility between different people or groups could also categorize war. And that's where things fundamentally change, because we begin to see that perhaps this state of conflict and war is not just something that is done by a group of people, but it could also be brought to our personal lives, our interactions with each other. And that changes almost everything. And so we ask ourselves, so where does that come from? Where does this feeling of having to be better than other people or command other people or dictate what other people do or impose our will on other people, where does that come from? Well, fortunately for us, Spiritists, we have wonderful resources to allude to. And one of those, is perhaps my favorite, is the Spirit's Book. And when we look at the Spirit's Book and search for information that the higher spirits may have given us about war and conflict, we find question 742. And in question 742, Kardec asks the spirits, what is the cause? What is the origin of war? And they give us an interesting perspective. They say, it is the predominance of our animal nature over our spiritual nature, and our search for satisfaction for our own passions. And that is a game changer in many different ways, because it's not about countries. It's not about groups of people. It is about an individual driver, individual characteristics that manifest themselves in us, which lead us to then wage war. And when we get other people to feel the same way we do, and when we band in groups and foster that kind of thing, then formal war happens. However, I wonder if at the start, the beginning of war is not individual per nature. And that is a big and fundamental shift, because it leads us to ask ourselves whether we are waging war in our everyday lives. And that is the difficult question that we bring. Because it starts with each and every one of us. How we feel with each other, how we relate to each other, is the key to this quality of relationships that can be perceived at an individual level, on a group level, or on a national level. So we could make the case that when we don't act kindly, when we are acting in an aggressive manner towards each other, when we are so intent in forcing our worldviews on others, we are waging war. Perhaps not physical and military war, but we are starting to wage emotional and spiritual war, in the manners of speaking, which eventually leads to the escalation and leads to the idea that we should confront people physically if we don't check ourselves. And that is a very key piece, because if we are true with ourselves, we must ask this very difficult question, which is, how are we triggering war in our everyday lives? Are we waging war in our everyday lives? And I think that if we take a moment to ponder over this, we perhaps will find that there are moments in our lives where we were not necessarily proud of the actions we've taken, how we've related to others. And that may have led to many different relationships and many difficult relationships over time. And maybe those problems persist today. And maybe they continue to make us feel less than great inside. And as we continue to struggle with this idea, we begin to realize that we do have actually quite a bit of say and impact in the way that the world lives, because it's sort of contagious, so to speak. If I am rude to you as I'm driving and I cut you off in the morning on my way to work, maybe you tune into that and you're not happy about it, and then now you have this attitude that you have been wronged and you're not happy, and then you start to act that way towards others because you're mistrusting of others' behaviors because I just wronged you. And it could be a chain reaction that goes on. And without noticing, we get ourselves trapped in this feeling of, I need to defend myself because nobody else will when this world is going to hell in a handbasket. And everything is horrible, so I might as well do what I can to get myself happy and satisfied now. And that, in a way, is sort of a reflection of what we see out there in the world. But we want to break that, and we want to change that considerably, because we know that we want to answer that question of how is it that we change from waging war emotionally every day to becoming peacemakers. And the only way to do that we can think of, or at least the most successful way, is to remember our spiritual essence. And this is where Spiritism has been so kind to us, because it has gotten us so much knowledge and has shown us firsthand through our interaction with the spiritual world that we are indeed spiritual beings, that we are just here temporarily. And when we begin to internalize that and realize that our lives go beyond the physical realm, that we live as many times as it takes for us to grow, we begin to detach ourselves a little bit of this extreme importance we place on satisfying our own desires and needs in this lifetime. Because we know that we cannot take any of this with us, and that we are going to continue to come back as many times as we need to grow and perfect ourselves. So as we begin to understand that we are immortal being, and that we reincarnate as many times, and tomorrow I can be reincarnated in a different country, speaking a different language and a different gender than the one that I live in today, our motivation to assert supremacy over others may not be as high. It may not disappear overnight, but I think that once we begin to remember our spiritual essence, we will also begin to understand that as immortal beings that we are, and part of this larger journey of life that takes many lifetimes through incarnation, that we have a role to play in not only calming our own internal conflicts, but also helping the world around us become a better place. There is this twofold reality where we are not only trying to better ourselves, but that bettering ourselves requires us to contribute to the world. And by contributing to the world, in turn, we're also helping ourselves be better. And that's a beautiful moment when we realize that it's not about those base instincts and that animal nature that question 742 talked about in the Spirit's book. That's not the way to go. That indeed the Spirits were really wise in telling us that we need to look outside ourselves and not think just our emotional satisfactions. And when we do that, and when we start to operate on ourselves and on others, then we start to embrace this wonderful and lingering invitation we have received from perhaps the greatest Spirit that has ever graced us on earth, Jesus the Christ, who 2,000 years ago left us a wonderful invitation on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Because once we are peacemaking, when we are making peace not only for ourselves within our own challenges and for others, we are embracing and becoming children of God by accepting that all of us are siblings from the divine, that all of us are in our evolutionary process, and that all of us will reincarnate as many times as we need to evolve. And that makes it a little bit easier to become tolerant and to compromise with each other and find common solutions. And so where can we foster that peace? Well, we can do it in many different ways. And here are just some ways in which you can operate peace and help the world change. You can do that at home with your families and your larger families as well by working on the quality of those relationships. You can also work with your friends. You can also work on being peaceful at home or at school, at work or at school, and even in your neighborhood. And very importantly these days, we can also take a more kind and jovial presence online, even in our social media, when sometimes we are so quick to impose our views and judge others. So let's be kinder. Let's build this wonderful spiritual family together and realize beautiful peace on earth that would only benefit us from this incarnation and many more. And if you want to keep in touch and continue those bonds of fraternity, find me online too. I'll be glad to be part of your family and be a peacemaker with you. So God bless you, and peace on earth to all of us.